Okay, this one is going to sound completely unhinged, so just stay with me for a second. Right now, on this entire planet, there is exactly one species of human. Just us. And for almost the entire time humans have existed, that has not been true. There used to be several of us, walking around at the same time, sometimes in the same valleys, sometimes close enough to actually meet. So here's the question I could not stop thinking about. If there used to be multiple human species sharing this planet, where did all of them actually go? And why are we the only ones who made it? Let's start with how many of them there actually were, because the number is bigger than most people expect. There were Neanderthals across Europe and parts of Asia. There were Denisovans, a species we only know exists because of a handful of bones found in one cave in Siberia. Not from skeletons or footprints, just genetic fragments, small enough to fit in your palm. There were smaller, strange offshoot species too, tucked away on islands in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, evolving in near total isolation from everyone else. At one point, somewhere between 3 and 6 different human species were alive on Earth at the same time. And then, over a relatively short stretch of time, all of them disappeared, except us. So picture an actual moment from that overlap. A group of Homo sapiens recently arrived in a new valley somewhere near the edge of what's now the Middle East. The same general region scientists think most of the contact between sapiens and Neanderthals likely happened. They're not the only humans in this valley. There's already a Neanderthal group living along the ridge a few days' walk away. People who've been adapted to this exact terrain for tens of thousands of years longer than the new arrivals have existed as a species. I'll call the sapiens group's lead scout Talia, and the Neanderthal hunter she eventually crosses paths with, Korr. Not because we know either of their names, obviously, but because it's easier to follow a story with people in it than a population graph. Korr's group has every advantage on paper. They know this terrain. They're built for cold, heavier brow ridges, stockier frames, bodies that hold heat better than anything Talia's group showed up with. If you'd bet on which group survives the next ice age based purely on physical adaptation, you'd bet on Korr's people every single time. And for tens of thousands of years, that bet would have paid off, because Neanderthals had already been thriving in harsh European climates since long before sapiens ever left Africa. But here's the part that doesn't show up if you're only looking at bones. When Talia's group runs short on food one season, they don't just rely on each other. They send word to 2 other sapiens groups several valleys over, groups they're not related to, groups they met years earlier under completely different circumstances. And those groups send help back. Korr's people don't really have that. Their networks tend to stay close, tight, regional. The kind of connections that work great until the one valley you depend on stops producing enough to support everyone in it. This actually matches something researchers found when they modeled this exact period using techniques borrowed from digital ecology, mapping out where each species could realistically survive based on climate swings between roughly 60 and 35,000 years ago. The conclusion wasn't simply that Neanderthals lost to a colder climate, or that sapiens just outcompeted them in a straightforward fight over land. It was something a little less dramatic and a lot more interesting. Sapiens seem to have built wider, more flexible social networks, while Neanderthal connections stayed more fragile and tied to one region. When conditions got unpredictable fast, having 3 other valleys to call on mattered more than having the better cold weather body. Here's where the story actually gets uncomfortable, in a way most people don't expect. Korr's group and Talia's group don't just compete for the same berries and the same herds. At some point, some of them have children together. We know this isn't speculation because it shows up directly in DNA today. Most people with ancestry outside Africa carry measurable amounts of Neanderthal genetic material, some populations up to around 4%. This wasn't a one-time event between 2 specific people. It happened often enough and early enough that it shaped the genetic makeup of basically everyone alive right now. And there's a theory about this part that genuinely surprised researchers when they laid it out. it's possible Neanderthals weren't pushed toward extinction primarily by violence or even by direct competition for resources. It's possible they were pulled toward it, slowly, through interbreeding itself. If enough Neanderthal individuals kept having children with sapiens instead of with each other, generation after generation, the population of purely Neanderthals would have simply shrunk on its own. Not because anyone was fighting anyone, but because the species was quietly folding into a different one through its own descendants. Picture Korr standing on that ridge one winter, watching smoke rise from 3 different sapiens camps spread across the valley below, camps that didn't exist when his grandfather was alive. He's not losing a war. There's no final battle here, no last stand anyone wrote down, because nobody was writing anything down. He's just watching a slow demographic tide that nobody in his lifetime could have actually seen happening in real time. The kind of change that's only visible if you're looking at it from 40,000 years away. Now, here's where it gets stranger, because Neanderthals weren't even the most mysterious species in this story. The Denisovans barely left us anything at all. We know they existed almost entirely from a handful of bone fragments in one Siberian cave, and from the genetic traces they left behind in modern populations, especially in Oceania and parts of Southeast Asia, where some groups carry noticeably more Denisovan ancestry than almost anywhere else on Earth. One of the most striking individual finds was a teenage girl whose father was Denisovan and whose mother was a fully Neanderthal woman with ancestry from Western Europe, meaning these weren't separate, isolated species quietly living parallel lives. They were actively mixing with each other too, not just with us. So if Denisovans were also interbreeding, also adapting, also spread across an enormous range, from frozen Siberian mountains to tropical Southeast Asian jungles, why don't we know more about how they disappeared? The honest answer, which researchers will tell you directly, is that we don't fully know. Competition for resources as sapiens populations expanded into the same territory is one likely piece of it. Simple absorption into the growing sapiens gene pool may be another. But compared to Neanderthals, the Denisovan story is still mostly written in fragments, a handful of bones and a few genetic echoes scattered across modern populations who have no idea they're carrying around the only real evidence that this species existed at all. There's one more detail that quietly explains a lot of this, and it has nothing to do with fighting or even climate directly. Somewhere between 50 and 75,000 years ago, body lice split off from head lice as a separate species, which sounds like a strange thing to bring up, except body lice can only survive in clothing. That timing tells researchers something concrete. Sapiens were likely wearing stitched, fitted garments earlier and more effectively than Neanderthals were, who mostly relied on draped animal skins for warmth. It's such a small detail, lice of all things, and yet it might represent one of the actual edges that let sapiens spread into colder, harsher environments faster and more reliably than their cold-adapted cousins could. And that leads to maybe the strangest twist in the entire story. Neanderthals were, by almost every physical measure, better built for the world they were living in. Heavier bodies, better cold tolerance, generations of adaptation to exactly the climate they were standing in. But evolution doesn't reward who's best adapted to right now. It rewards whoever can handle things changing. When the climate swung hard and fast over and over across thousands of years, being extremely well-suited to one specific set of conditions stopped being an advantage and started being a liability, because those conditions kept disappearing out from under them. Sometimes the species that looks the strongest on paper is the one standing closest to the edge, simply because it was built for a world that was never going to stay still. So here's what actually happened to all of them, as far as the evidence can tell us. Not a single extinction event, not one war, not one die-off. Multiple species, mixing, competing, adapting, failing to adapt fast enough, and slowly folding into one outcome. A single surviving human species, carrying small genetic fragments of all the others inside it. Korr's story and Talia's story don't really end in a fight. They end in a population, several generations later, that has both of their genes mixed in, without anyone remembering either of their names. So here's what I actually want to know from you. If the species that wins isn't the strongest one, or even the smartest one, but the one with the widest, most flexible network of people it can call on when things go wrong, what does that actually say about which of us are built to survive the next version of unpredictable? Tell me honestly in the comments. And don't just give the comfortable answer. Actually think about whether your own network looks more like Talia's or more like Korr's. I'll see you in the next one.